Good evening. Today, we are analyzing a massive structural shift in how our culture processes contemporary folklore, looking directly at the intersection of high-concept media and public narrative design. For generations, historical epics were understood through text and linear documentation. However, we have officially entered a new baseline of communication, where the construction of modern myths is dictated entirely by massive cinematic spectacles. The recent intellectual discourse surrounding complex narrative framing highlights a profound institutional phenomenon: the transition away from grounded, literal history toward sweeping non-linear allegories that reshape public consciousness. The core challenge facing the modern landscape is not merely how audiences consume complex media, but how these highly produced cultural artifacts alter our collective perception of reality, time, and human capability. Media analysts point out that this storytelling evolution creates an immense conceptual gap. While the general public operates in a real-time digital environment driven by immediate algorithmic outputs, the narrative engines shaping long-term cultural identity rely on deep, multi-layered visual experiences. This dynamic creates a powerful psychological framework. When structural narratives use vast, overarching concepts to explore human endurance, they effectively bypass traditional analytical channels, speaking directly to institutional anxieties. The domestic impact of this cinematic scale is manifesting across the entire creative sector, as foundational creative standards are systematically pushed aside to favor massive, systemic world-building projects that demand absolute dedication from the audience. Furthermore, the internal mechanics of the modern entertainment ecosystem have become deeply locked into this macro-scale paradigm. Rising independent creators find their cultural footprint restricted because the broader market is completely dominated by massive, complex intellectual properties that demand immense structural resources. This creates an artificial ceiling where alternative narrative forms struggle to find institutional support. Concurrently, the strategic relationship between cultural producers and the mainstream audience has fractured along conceptual lines, creating a distinct narrative vacuum where fundamental public discussions are deferred until they are framed through a major cinematic event. As the technical demands of a hyper-connected audience continue to accelerate, the contrast between rapid, short-form media consumption and deep, prolonged systemic epics grows starker by the day. The resilience of modern cultural institutions depends on their ability to balance superficial trends with enduring strategic visions, yet the current media guardrails are increasingly locked into a cycle of high production dependency. The stage is set for a massive reckoning within narrative design, and the structural integrity of our media consumption habits is facing its ultimate stress test. Stay with us as we unpack the full cultural and geopolitical consequences of this narrative shift in our next segment. The long-term cultural fallout from this macro-scale narrative shift is rapidly transforming from a simple entertainment trend into a profound crisis of public perception. As our everyday information streams become increasingly fragmented by rapid technological notifications, the structural frameworks we use to understand history are being rewritten through non-linear cinematic architecture. The core vulnerability here is no longer just about the complexity of a director's vision. It is about how these shattered timelines alter the public's capacity to process cause and effect in the real world. Media studies indicate that when cultural institutions continuously substitute chronological facts with emotional, hyper-stylized allegories, the collective memory of major historical shifts becomes completely decentralized. In the immediate wake of this narrative evolution, the structural defects of traditional media education have become impossible to ignore. For the modern audience, this reliance on massive cinematic epics has triggered a significant shift in how historical truth is validated. Cognitive analysts point out that the general population is no longer looking to primary records or administrative documentation to understand foundational events. Instead, they wait for a high-budget cultural event to define the parameters of the discussion. Rather than engaging with the messy, systemic reality of past crises, the audience is conditioned to view complex global challenges as neatly packaged cinematic character studies. This structural calcification leaves the public deeply vulnerable to automated misinformation, as the decision-making apparatus lacks the critical baseline needed to separate historical data from cinematic spectacle. But while technical analysts track the decline in traditional media literacy, the internal power dynamic within media distribution channels has created an even tighter bottleneck. The continuous corporate protection of massive, multi-million-dollar intellectual properties has completely starved alternative storytellers of cultural mobility. Talented independent documentarians and investigative journalists find their audience reach permanently capped by distribution protocols that prioritize sheer cinematic scale over empirical accuracy. Instead of fostering a healthy, diverse informational environment where competing perspectives can rise to the top, the current framework forces crucial alternative narratives completely out of the mainstream consciousness. Simultaneously, the broader strategic relationship between media producers and the general workforce has fractured along distinct economic lines. The continuous insulation of major studio gatekeepers means that the individuals drafting national cultural priorities are entirely separated from the everyday financial and social realities facing their audience. This representation vacuum creates a profound policy mismatch, where critical advancements in digital copyright protections, creative automation, and fair compensation for artists are systematically stalled because the leadership structure operates on an entirely different economic timeline. The stability of our cultural fabric is facing an unprecedented stress test, and the question is no longer whether our media models need structural renewal, but how long they can endure under the weight of their own administrative inertia. Stay tuned as we dive into the next phase of this unfolding systemic breakdown. The structural gridlock within this macro-scale narrative ecosystem extends far beyond frozen distribution pipelines. It has fundamentally short-circuited the primary critical channels between cultural producers and the general public. In an era where cultural commentary moves instantaneously across decentralized networks, the traditional gatekeepers of public critique rely on a deeply centralized legacy media framework that is fundamentally incapable of processing real-time societal feedback. This disconnect creates a profound communication void. When the linguistic tools, satirical strategies, and editorial priorities of major media institutions remain completely unchanged for decades, the official critique becomes entirely uncoupled from the empirical reality on the ground. The result is an institutional echo chamber where late-night programs and media executives speak only to themselves, entirely insulated from the shifting cultural and economic realities of the population they claim to analyze. Sociological research highlights that this media insulation has triggered an unprecedented drop in institutional trust across every major demographic sector. Because the entrenched entertainment establishment continues to deploy communication playbooks optimized for a bygone media ecosystem, their public messaging consistently misses the mark. Complex public anxieties regarding the commercialization of art, creative automation, and structural media inflation are routinely answered with generic, outdated comedic tropes that offer no concrete structural insight. This systematic failure to critique effectively does more than just alienate the audience. It actively fuels widespread cynicism, driving the public to abandon traditional cultural commentary in favor of unverified, hyper-polarized digital spaces. The critical breakdown has effectively paralyzed the democratic consensus, leaving the audience unable to unite behind any coherent cultural analysis. On the international stage, this domestic communication void is rapidly transforming into a major strategic vulnerability. Global cultural competitors and foreign media networks alike closely monitor these internal deadlocks to assess a nation's long-term soft power stability. When a country's primary satirical and analytical institutions appear consistently incapable of communicating a coherent, modern vision to their own citizens, their external projection of cultural influence is fundamentally undermined. International media initiatives lose credibility because the global community doubts whether a stagnant, hyper-insulated entertainment apparatus can successfully maintain domestic creative relevance. The structural calcification of the media elite is no longer a localized entertainment problem. It has evolved into a clear threat to national cultural standing. As the cultural machinery continues to operate within this self-contained bubble, the margin for systemic error narrows by the day. An analytical apparatus that cannot authentically communicate with its people cannot effectively critique the power structures above them, and the structural integrity of the entire framework is rapidly reaching its breaking point. Stay with us as we head into the next part of this comprehensive investigation, where we analyze the hidden economic costs of this creative stagnation. While the institutional echo chamber continues to freeze authentic cultural critique, the most immediate and devastating impact of this narrative gridlock is playing out across the industry's balance sheet. Creative infrastructure requires continuous diversification to absorb technological shifts, yet the financial frameworks governing our media production remain locked in a state of permanent consolidation. For the modern independent creative sector, this corporate prioritization of massive cinematic events functions as a hidden systemic tax on artistic innovation. When the individuals managing studio budgets operate on legacy industrial models formalized during the mid-20th century, the resulting fiscal allocation systematically diverts capital away from emerging storytellers and toward the preservation of predictable, hyper-consolidated intellectual properties. Financial analysts point out that this administrative inertia has triggered an unprecedented investment gap in critical, diverse storytelling formats. While competing global digital markets aggressively fund next-generation interactive narratives, decentralized independent media hubs, and collaborative creator frameworks, the traditional domestic studio apparatus remains fixated on box office metrics and legacy streaming bundles. This systemic failure to adapt leaves the modern creative workforce deeply vulnerable. Emerging writers, independent directors, and visual artists are increasingly forced to navigate an oppressive, highly restrictive intellectual property landscape, driving essential talent and capital out of the mainstream market altogether. Furthermore, the domestic entertainment market is experiencing a profound structural mismatch directly tied to this production freeze. The modern audience has rapidly transitioned toward highly customized, real-time digital content delivery, requiring a complete overhaul of traditional theatrical windows, pricing models, and creative compensation systems. Yet, because the entrenched corporate elite remains fundamentally disconnected from the economic precarity facing the younger workforce, traditional labor guardrails and creative protections remain rigid and entirely unequipped for the gig-driven digital economy. This policy deficit creates a massive structural drag, depressing creative wage growth and accelerating production deficits, while the foundational infrastructure supporting the national arts community slowly degrades. As global market pressures intensify, a cultural industry cannot hope to maintain creative dominance when its primary architects are structurally incapable of navigating the digital age. The systemic stability of the entire media ecosystem is reaching a critical inflection point where short-term corporate mergers will no longer suffice to mask the underlying structural decay. Stay with us as we move into the final segment, where we analyze the definitive reckoning facing this monolithic establishment.
We have traced the systemic monopolies, the chronological distortions, and the massive critical voids of a cultural architecture locked in a state of permanent corporate arrest. But the final chapter of this media crisis is not a chronicle of inevitable decline. It is an announcement of an unstoppable democratization. No legacy studio or entrenched distribution gatekeeper can permanently contain the accelerating demand for narrative sovereignty. The baseline of creative expression must eventually realign with the decentralized, real-time reality of the population it speaks to, or risk absolute cultural obsolescence. Across the global media landscape, this structural stagnation is already triggering a profound counterreaction. Independent creator collectives, decentralized production networks, and a new generation of digital visionaries are no longer waiting for traditional studio executives to greenlight their projects. Instead, they are actively utilizing open-source tools, collaborative funding models, and direct-to-audience distribution platforms to bypass the old gatekeepers entirely. From the ground up, new frameworks for interactive storytelling, transparent royalty tracking, and community-driven narrative development are being successfully deployed. This grassroots modernization proves that true creative genius does not require a multi-million-dollar legacy apparatus. It simply requires the strategic willpower to build the future of media in the present. As these parallel networks reach a critical mass, the ultimate lesson of this long-term cultural freeze becomes undeniably clear. True media resilience is never achieved by monopolizing the imagination or fortifying an outdated corporate status quo. A nation's soft power is measured by its capacity for continuous creative self-correction, its agility in embracing radical technological tools, and its commitment to keeping the pathways of cultural leadership open to diverse, fresh perspectives. The old paradigms of the hyper-consolidated spectacle have hit their absolute structural limit, and the foundation for a highly agile, accessible storytelling lifecycle is already firmly in place. The immediate industry shocks will continue to test the system. The old distribution models will continue to crack, but the trajectory toward a democratized narrative cannot be stopped. The architecture of modern imagination is evolving, and the next generation of storytellers is ready to take the screen. Thank you for staying with us through this comprehensive, multi-part strategic investigation. Analyze the content, challenge the gatekeepers, and stay vigilant. Good night. We have traced the systemic monopolies, the chronological distortions, and the massive critical voids of a cultural architecture locked in a state of permanent corporate arrest. But the final chapter of this media crisis is not a chronicle of inevitable decline. It is an announcement of an unstoppable democratization. No legacy studio or entrenched distribution gatekeeper can permanently contain the accelerating demand for narrative sovereignty. The baseline of creative expression must eventually realign with the decentralized, real-time reality of the population it speaks to, or risk absolute cultural obsolescence. Across the global media landscape, this structural stagnation is already triggering a profound counter-reaction. Independent creator collectives, decentralized production networks, and a new generation of digital visionaries are no longer waiting for traditional studio executives to greenlight their projects. Instead, they are actively utilizing open-source tools, collaborative funding models, and direct-to-audience distribution platforms to bypass the old gatekeepers entirely. From the ground up, new frameworks for interactive storytelling, transparent royalty tracking, and community-driven narrative development are being successfully deployed. This grassroots modernization proves that true creative genius does not require a multi-million-dollar legacy apparatus. It simply requires the strategic willpower to build the future of media in the present.
As these parallel networks reach a critical mass, the ultimate lesson of this long-term cultural freeze becomes undeniably clear. True media resilience is never achieved by monopolizing the imagination or fortifying an outdated corporate status quo. A nation's soft power is measured by its capacity for continuous, creative self-correction, its agility in embracing radical technological tools, and its commitment to keeping the pathways of cultural leadership open to diverse, fresh perspectives. The old paradigms of the hyper-consolidated spectacle have hit their absolute structural limit, and the foundation for a highly agile, accessible storytelling lifecycle is already firmly in place. The immediate industry shocks will continue to test the system. The old distribution models will continue to crack, but the trajectory toward a democratized narrative cannot be stopped. The architecture of modern imagination is evolving, and the next generation of storytellers is ready to take the screen. Thank you for staying with us through this comprehensive, multi-part strategic investigation. Analyze the content, challenge the gatekeepers, and stay vigilant. Good night.